بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي على رسوله الكريم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين وبارك وسلم تسليما كثيرا كثيرا رب اشرح لنا صدورنا ويسر لنا أمورنا واحلل عقدة من لساننا يفقه قولنا السلام عليكم wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. To all of our viewers, we extend the eternal and the universal salutation of peace. Alhamdulillah, first of all, we begin by thanking Almighty Allah for all of the boons and favors that He has bestowed upon us. Ultimately, we thank Almighty Allah for granting us life itself and for enabling us to once again be here for another segment of the Al-Quran series. Also, we take the opportunity to welcome all of our viewers who are joining us for another episode of the Al-Quran series, where it is our aim and our goal to educate ourselves with regards to reciting the text of the Holy Quran. As we all know, being able to recite the text of the Holy Quran is a very, very important ingredient in the spiritual life of a Muslim. A person who is able to recite the Quran, he is able to derive more blessing, more nur, more light in his life from Almighty Allah. In one hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which I would like to share with our viewers, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, mentioned, إِنَّ الَّذِي لَيْسَ فِي جَوْفِهِ شَيْءٌ مِّنَ الْقُرْآنِ كَالْبَيْتِ الْخَرِبِ. That he in whose heart is no part of the Quran is like a deserted house. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in this hadith, he's aiming to impress upon us the importance of learning Al-Quran, to the extent that if a person, he does not learn the Quran and he has no part of the Quran in his heart, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, gave the example of that of a deserted house. A deserted house is derived of all goodness. Similarly, that heart in which the Quran is not present, and that heart which is devoid of Al-Quran is similarly devoid of all goodness. So let us make an effort to educate ourselves, inshaAllah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy for us. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continue to guide us and accept our efforts in learning Al-Quran. So in today's episode, we will be talking about the common letters. Previously, we have already covered the capital letters. On today's episode, we will be focusing on the common letters of the Arabic alphabet. And before we move forward, I would also like to let my viewers know that when we talk about common letters, we should very carefully take into consideration the various different shapes of each letter. Each letter would have a different shape. If the letter appears at the beginning of a word, the shape may vary if it appears in the middle of a word, and it would also look somewhat different when it appears at the end of a word. So as we go through the alphabet and as we go through the Arabic text with regard to the common letters, let us try to focus on the various shapes. Some letters would come isolated. Some letters, they would be able to become joined from the beginning of a word, in the middle, and in the end. So let us pay special attention to that as we move forward. So the first letter of the Arabic alphabet is the letter Alif. This is the capital formation of the letter Alif, and as we convert that into common, the letter Alif comes in an isolated form. The letter Alif cannot be joined in the beginning of a word. It comes in an isolated form. And this is the example of the letter Alif which appears in an isolated form in the beginning of a word. If we notice, the shape remains the same and the letter itself is not joined to the second letter. Hence, observing and maintaining that isolated formation. So the alif would not be joined in the initial part of a word, neither would it be joined in the middle formation of a word. The alif can then be joined at the end of a word, and this is what it would look like. The shape would be somewhat different from the isolated formation. This is an example. If we look at this particular word in the Arabic language, we can see that the last letter appearing in this word is the alif. And this is the formation it would take when it is joined at the end of a word. So again, the letter alif can come in an isolated formation at the beginning of a word. It would not be joined at the beginning of a word, neither would it be joined in the middle of a word. It would then be joined at the end of a word, as we see in these examples. As we move on to the next letter, the second letter of the Arabic alphabet is the letter ba. This that we are seeing appearing on the screen is ba in the capital formation, the letter ba. And as we move forward, let us focus on the different formations of this particular letter in the beginning, in the middle, and in the end. So this is what ba, the letter ba, would look like in the beginning of a word. This is common ba, the common formation of the ba, but it is this formation that would appear if the ba comes at the beginning of a word. This is an example. This word we are seeing here is a word in the Arabic language, and if we observe the ba here, the common ba appearing at the beginning of the word, we look at the formation and we understand that the dot in the letter ba comes underneath. The middle formation that ba would take on when joining in the middle of a word, it looks somewhat like this. Again, we focus on the shape and let us take into consideration the dot that appears underneath. Let us look at an example. This is a word in the Arabic language, and we can see the formation of common ba when it appears in the middle of a word. And then finally, the last formation, ba in the common form, when attached to the ending of a word. And this is the example of the shape in which it would take. Again, the three different shapes, one at the beginning, one in the middle, and one at the very end. Let us take into consideration and pay special attention to the shapes of the various letters and also the dot which appears at the bottom. We move on to the next letter. This letter that is appearing on the screen is the letter ta, again in the capital formation. And let us now look at the common formations that this particular letter would take on either in the beginning, middle, or the end of any word of the Arabic language. So this is the formation. Again, very similar to the letter ba in the common form. The letter ta takes on a similar formation, but the dots here would appear on top. Let us look at an example in the Arabic text. This is a word in the Arabic language, and as we can observe, this letter has the letter ta with the same formation and the two dots coming as the first letter of this particular word. We move on to the middle. Ta, the letter ta, when it appears in the middle of a word, it looks something like this shape. Let us look at an example from the Arabic text. This is another word of the Arabic language, and in this word, ta in the common form now appears in the middle of this particular word. Finally, towards the end, ta, the letter ta, when it appears at the end of a word, it takes on this shape. Again, let us focus on the shape, focus on the dots, and this is an example, another Arabic word, an example of ta in the common form when it appears at the end of a word. So very, very important. Sometimes we may feel that it is all a little bit complex, but at the end of it, it's very simple. If we were to focus on the shapes of the various letters, together with the dots, it helps us to identify the letters in the common form. We move on to the third letter. This letter is the letter tha. The letter tha in the Arabic language, and this is tha in the capital formation. Let us observe the common formation. Again, this is a very similar shape to ba and a very similar shape to ta, the letters which came before. So tha, this particular letter would appear in this shape with 3 dots on top, and this is the formation that this letter would take on when appearing at the beginning of a word. This is an example. This is a word in the Arabic language, and we can observe the tha here being joined at the beginning of the word with the 3 dots appearing on top. When tha appears in the middle of a word, this is the shape and the formation that it would take on. Let us look at an example. Again, another Arabic word, but in this word, the tha appears in the middle of this particular word, and this formation would then come into being. Finally, the ending formation, again very similar to the letters which have gone before, ba and ta. Tha takes on this formation when it appears at the end of a word. And this is the example. This is what tha would look like when joined at the end or when coming at the end of any word in the Arabic language. We move on to the next letter. This letter that we are seeing appearing on the screen is the letter Jim, the letter Jim of the Arabic language. In the capital formation, there is 1 dot which appears in the center of this particular letter. Let us observe the common formations. This shape that we are seeing here, this is the shape of Jim in the common formation. We can observe the dot which appears underneath the letter. And let us look now at an example of a word in the Arabic language so that we can get an understanding of how this letter is joined at the beginning of the word. So this is a word in the Arabic language. And as we can see, the same shape, formation, and we can also see the dot which appears underneath. This formation comes into being when the Jim appears in the beginning of this particular word. Let us look at the middle formation. This is the shape of Jim. This is the shape that Jim would take on when appearing in the middle of a word of the Arabic language. Again, observe the shape and take into consideration and acknowledge the dot which appears underneath. Let us look at an example. This is a word of the Arabic language, and here we can see the letter Jim appearing right in the center of this word. The same shape, but the dot appears underneath. Finally, let us look at Jim when it appears at the end of a word. Let us observe closely the shape and also observe the dot which appears in the center of the letter. This is an example of a word in the Arabic language. This word, we can observe the letter Jim is here appearing at the end of this particular word. So these 3 formations, beginning, middle, and end, we should try to familiarize ourselves with these common formations. We move on to the next letter. This letter, the letter ha, again the letter ha which is pronounced with emphasis. This letter appears with no dot whatsoever. And this letter appearing on the screen is the capital formation of the letter ha. Let us now observe the common formations. First of all, we look at the letter ha when it appears at the beginning of a word. Let us familiarize ourselves with the shape and take into consideration and acknowledge and observe that there is absolutely no dot appearing on this letter. This is an example of a word in the Arabic language. Again, we can observe how the letter ha is joined at the beginning of this word. As we move on, let us look at the middle formation. This is the formation that ha would take on in the common formation when it appears in the middle of a word. And we look at the example. Again, this is an Arabic word, and we can observe ha appearing in the middle of this particular word. Finally, we look at the ending formation. Again, this is ha, and this is the formation that this letter would take when appearing at the very end of a word. And we look at an example. Again, let us observe how the letter ha appears in this formation when it is connected to the end of this particular word. We move on to the next letter. This letter appearing on the screen is the letter kha. The letter kha is pronounced with a little bit of a grating sound coming out of the throat of the individual. The letter kha in the capital formation. Let us now move on by observing the common formations of this particular letter when it appears in the beginning, the middle, or the end of any particular word. So this shape that we are seeing here, this is a shape that the letter kha would take on in the common formation when appearing in the beginning of a word. And we look at an example. This is a word in the Arabic language, and let us observe how the letter kha, the shape it takes on when being joined at the beginning of this particular word. Let us look at the middle formation. This shape that we are seeing here, together with the dot that appears on top, this is the shape of the letter kha that would appear when the letter kha comes in the middle of a word. And this is an example. This is another word of the Arabic language. And we can observe how the letter kha is joined right at the middle of this particular word. Thirdly, we look at the end formation. Again, very similar to jim, but in this case, the dot then appears on top as opposed to the center. And we look at the example, again another word from the Arabic language, and we can see very clearly here how the letter kha is joined at the very end of this particular word. As we move on to the next letter, this letter is the letter dal. This is a letter dal which appears in the capital formation. Let us now observe the various common formations of this particular letter. So the letter dal can appear in an isolated form. There is no joining of this particular letter in the beginning of a word, as we can see from the example here appearing on the screen. If we observe, the letter appears in an isolated form, unjoined with the letters of that particular word. When we look at the initial stage, we can see the letter is not joined from the beginning, neither is it joined from the middle. So in other words, the letter dal cannot be joined to a word in the beginning, neither is there any middle formation for this letter. There is, however, the end formation of this particular letter. Let us look at the example. This is what the letter dal would look like when it is joined at the very end of a word. So this particular letter comes in an isolated form. It is not joined at the beginning of any word, nor does it join in the middle of a word. It only comes at the very end of the word of the Arabic language. We move on to the next letter. This letter appearing on the screen is the letter dhal in the capital formation. Let us now observe the common formations that this particular letter can take on. So the letter dhal can appear in the isolated formation. We look at the example. This is a word in the Arabic language, and we can observe the letter dhal is not joined at the beginning. It is only there in an isolated formation. So that means that the letter dhal cannot be joined at the beginning of a word. Neither can it be joined in the middle of a word. It can, however, be joined towards the end of a word. And this is the shape that we are seeing here. We look at the example. This is the Arabic word, and we can observe the letter dhal appearing right at the end of this particular word. We move on to the next letter. This letter, the letter ra in the capital formation. And let us again observe the shapes of the common formation as they appear in the words of the Arabic text. The letter ra, this also can only appear in an isolated formation. When we look at the example, again we can tell that the letter ra cannot be joined in the beginning of a word. It can only come in an isolated formation, nor can it also be joined in the middle of the word. It can, however, be joined towards the very end of a word, and this is the shape and the formation that the letter ra would take on when it comes at the end of a word. This is the example. an Arabic word. We can observe the ra being joined towards the very end of this word. We move on to the next letter. This letter, the letter za. Again, the letter za in the capital formation with one dot appearing on top. We look at the formations of the common formations. Za can only be presented and it can only appear in the isolated formation. Za cannot be joined in the beginning of a word, nor cannot be joined in the middle of a word. It can only be joined towards the end of a word. So beginning, no joining. Middle also, no joining. There would only be a joining towards the end of the word, and this is the example that we are seeing. As we move on to the next letter, this letter is the letter sin, the capital formation of the letter sin. Let us observe now the common formations of this particular letter. This is the shape of sin in the common formation that it would take on when being joined in the beginning of an Arabic word. And we look at the example. This is the example of an Arabic word, and we can see the letter sin appearing at the beginning. This is the shape that the letter sin would take on when being joined in the middle of a word. And this is the example of the Arabic word. We can observe sin being joined at the middle. At the very end, this is the shape that sin would take on when it comes at the end of a word. We move on to the next letter. This letter, the letter shin, very similar to the letter sin. And we look at the common formations, very similar to the letter sin, but the dots, 3 dots, would now appear on top. This is the formation when the letter appears at the beginning of a word. This is the formation when shin would appear at the end of a word, at the middle of the word. And this is the formation that we are seeing appearing on the screen when the letter shin would be coming at the very end of the word. So very important to observe the different formations of the beginning, middle, and the end. We move on to the next letter, the letter sod. This letter, again in the capital formation, we look at the various formations when this particular letter would appear in different phases of the word. At the beginning, this is the shape that the letter would take on, as we can see from the example. The middle formation, this is the shape, as we can see from this example. And the ending formation, as we can see from this particular example. The last letter in today's segment, the letter dad. Again, we look at the capital formation. The common formations, quite similar to the letter sod, but there is one dot appearing on top that we should definitely take note of. So this is the shape when it appears at the beginning of a word, as we can see from this example. This is the shape that it would take on when appearing in the middle of a word, as we can see from this example. And finally, this is the shape of the letter dad when it appears at the end of a word, as we can see from this particular example. So very important when we are trying to identify the common letters, that we should take into consideration the shapes of the various letters as they appear in the beginning, middle, or the end. So that, my dear viewers, brings us to the end of this episode of the Al-Quran series. First of all, I would like to thank Almighty Allah, who has given us life, health, and strength, and He has made it possible that we were able to deliver another episode of the Al-Quran series. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it a means of our guidance, inshaAllah ta'ala. Also, we'd like to thank our viewers who have been tuning in with us for another segment, another episode of the Al-Quran series. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it a means of our upliftment and our education. May He continue to guide us, inshaAllah ta'ala. By all means, join us soon for another episode of the Al-Quran series. Until then, Sadaqallahu al-Azim, wa sadaqa rasuluhu an-Nabiyyu al-Kareem, wa nahnu ala dhalika min ash-shahidin wa ash-shakirin, walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaykum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.